Skilled pilots perform some of the most difficult and dangerous plane landings imaginable. Here are 15 of the most difficult plane landings. Number 10. Barra Airport. Some places cannot afford the investment required to build a dedicated runway and airport facilities on the small Scottish island of Barra. For example, tarmac has been completely removed. This is the only place in the world where regularly scheduled flights land on a sandy beach. And timing is crucial because the entire runway is submerged underwater during high tide. Flights can only take place during the day. But if an emergency arises at night and you need to leave the island right away, the only animals that use the airport are twin otters, and given the breathtaking views as you touch down, it's no surprise that this is consistently voted as one of the best airport approaches in the world. Of course, controlling the aircraft requires a steady hand on the part of the pilot, because one mistake could send the aircraft crashing into a sand dune. There are 3 layouts for the vehicle lights that can be used to illuminate the beach. Number 9. Matekane Airstrip. Sudu is a small mountain country entirely within South Africa. If you don't want to attempt one of the bumpy, steep mountain roads that lead up to it, your only option is to travel there by plane. The country has very few flat areas and remote villages, but it does have one of the most extreme runways in the world, called Matekane Airstrip, which is mostly used by charitable organizations and medical flights to help the local communities. Although some of the locals preserve their uneven surface, the most remarkable feature is that, after navigating the peaks on the approach, pilots must perfectly touch down to avoid clipping the cliff edge. The approach terminates with a cliff that descends 2,000 feet because the runway isn't long enough to generate complete lift. Takeoffs here are especially worse because the planes crash against the brink before gathering enough momentum to take off. Before we move on, be sure to subscribe to Tech Cargo with notifications on. Number 8. Congonhas Airport. One of the busiest airports in South America, Congonhas Airport serves the cities of Sao Paulo and Brazil. However, pilots have long warned that the approach, especially towards the 1.2-mile-long runway 35, is so hazardous that it poses a risk of possible disaster. When the plane is about to land, you can't help but notice the high-rise buildings all around you. It feels like you're just skimming the tops of them during the final approach. When you combine this with the constantly shifting weather in the area, pilots in the industry have very little room to maneuver and touching down. It's known as the aviation carrier. And if the wheels don't touch the tarmac within the first 1,000 feet, they're instructed to stop and try again, because things frequently go wrong, and planes end up running off the tarmac. Airport officials have had to impose strict limits on the number of planes that can land there each hour, to ensure that nobody feels rushed into making decisions that could result in even more accidents. Number 7. Gisborne Airport. Situated close to the city of Gisborne, on the east coast of New Zealand's North Island, the 400-acre barren airport. This airport is rather unusual because of the limited space for routes in and out of the city. The main runway has a railway track that passes straight across it. It's one of the only places in the world where this happens and requires constant communication. Between air traffic control. At first glance, the 3 grass runways and the 300-foot main concrete runway look just like you'd expect from a single terminal airport. The railway and any planes that are arriving to make sure the runway is clear before taking off. However, there are plans to relocate the railway because it's an unnecessary complexity, particularly given the city's intention to start drawing more tourists in the coming years. Number 6. Tioman Airport. The only airport on the small Malaysian island of Timor is known throughout the area for being one of the hardest strips to land safely on. The issue isn't with the 32,542-foot runway itself, rather, it's with the approach to the tarmac, which is only visible in the final moments before landing. Pilots must set themselves on a course that takes them directly towards a mountain range, which is so counterintuitive that a checkerboard target has been installed to help them stay on course just before they reach it. Before landing, crews usually put on life jackets in case something goes wrong, which happens far more frequently than you'd think. They have to make a sharp 90-degree turn to align themselves with the runway, and then they must hope that they can land and stop in time. Overshooting causes a vertical drop off the cliff into the water. Number 5. Madeira Airport. The main considerations when choosing the ideal location for an airport are a flat area for the runway and as few hilly or mountainous areas as possible to allow aircraft plenty of room for maneuvers. However, what happens if this is simply not possible? That is what the planners on the small Portuguese island of Madeira faced. And the outcome was one of the most terrifying landings ever. Initially, the runway could only be 50,250 feet long. But after a nasty crash in 1977, warplanes crashed through a bridge at the end and came to an end on the sandy beach beyond it. Therefore, it had to be extended. The issue was that there wasn't enough land for it to be done. So engineers constructed 180,230-foot tall columns to support the extended tarmac over the beach. Although the runway is now much longer, the approach now entails flying low over the ocean and aiming towards a mountain peak. Pilots must quickly bank right to line up on the heading towards the runway, otherwise, they risk rolling off and ending up in the ocean. Every landing is made more difficult by the winds that blow over the ocean and our canal between the mountains. And the airport is infamous for its tumultuous and uneven landings. Number 4. McMurdo Station. The only practical way to transport supplies and personnel to McMurdo Station, an American research facility on the southern tip of Ross Island in Antarctica, is by plane. However, because the area is completely covered in snow and ice, the landing strip is unique. It is rebuilt each year for the summer, and by the time the sea ice breaks up in December, flights return to a more stable airfield farther away. Amazingly, it is strong enough to accommodate large aircraft like C-5 Galaxies and Boeing 757s. And when it's in use, pilots remark that the ice almost feels like landing on concrete. Naturally, dealing with the weather is much more difficult. Strong winds can seem to appear out of nowhere, and whiteouts are especially dangerous because they make it nearly impossible to tell where the land begins and the sky ends. One significant distinction is that, upon finalizing their landing, planes cause the ice they are on to sink several inches into the sea below. As a result, laser sights must be used to keep an eye on everything to avoid aircraft from falling into the water. The Lockheed IC-1201 warning star crash occurred in 1960, and while all crew members survived, no attempts were made to recover the plane due to its stuckness in the snow, and it was left to sink into the water. When the ice melted in the spring, this is the only accident that has ever occurred here. Number 3. Tenzing-Hillary Airport. 2019 tension-filled the more you learned about Hillary Airport, which is situated in the eastern Nepali town of Lul and is the starting point for many people aspiring to climb Mount Everest. The more you realized that the airport's reputation as the most dangerous in the world was well-deserved. At over 9,000 feet, it is surrounded by mountainous terrain with a steep drop at the end of the runway and a solid wall of other people, which makes it very difficult to land on one of the smallest runways in the world. There isn't enough room for a second try because there isn't enough place to fly around. The problems are exacerbated by bad weather, which makes it nearly impossible to see where the runway begins under low clouds. This has led to a number of accidents in recent years. The runway slant, which helps pilots slow down after a landing, is the only feature that works in their favor. The only aircraft that can land at this airport are small fixed-wing and helicopters, and before they are even permitted to try it, pilots must all undergo specialized instruction about the peculiarities of the area. Number 2. High wind landings. In ideal circumstances, while flying is one of the safest and most comfortable modes of transportation, conditions can quickly change and the wind picks up, particularly during the most dangerous part of any flight, takeoff or landing. Pilots aren't too affected by headwinds or tailwinds, but the more difficult a landing becomes, the stronger the wind is. And this is when pilots earn their pay, because no computer system can replace their instincts and quick reactions to safely bring the plane to a stop. It gives the impression that the plane is about to land at an angle to the runway. Of course, flying like this is perfectly okay when you're in the air, but the most crucial part is the transition between this dance and what happens when the wheels hit the tarmac. The main thing they try to do is keep the nose of a plane facing towards the wind, a process known as crabbing. This ensures that they can keep flying in a straight track across the ground. Although different aircraft are built to accomplish this in different ways, the larger passenger planes use a method known as the decrab during flare, and you ought to be able to witness it happening if you pay close attention. As the aircraft approaches the runway, the pilot pulls back on the stick as they normally would, which is known as flaring. This lowers the rate of descent and raises the nose of the aircraft, and just before the wheels touch down, there is movement of the rudder to straighten it up in line with the runway. If this isn't enough to be paying attention to, there's one more thing to be aware of. When a pilot lands in these conditions, they must simultaneously pull back on the control stick to turn into the wind and use their feet to control the rudder pedals. This is because when they straighten the aircraft, lift is generated beneath the wing that the crosswind is blowing onto. For this reason, the control wheel must be adjusted to compensate. Number 1. Juancho Yrausquin Airport. Airfield in Yrausquin, one of the most beautiful islands in the Caribbean, is Saba, the Netherlands. However, when an airport was decided to be built there was only one piece of land that was level enough for a runway, and it barely had enough room for a 13-12-foot stretch of tarmac slightly longer than an aircraft carrier. Not surprisingly, jets don't use the airport, and the only planes that land there are small twin otter aircraft. Only captains are permitted to control the plane as it approaches, because they must contend with unpredictable updrafts from the ocean, and the island's rugged topography makes it impossible for planes to overshoot the runway. It's amazing that there hasn't been an accident since it opened in the 1960s, considering there is a steep drop-off to the ocean below on either side of the cliff. Subscribe to Tech Cargo for more, and check out some of our other popular videos.